Good morning, friends. Welcome to the weekly current affairs class of Vajirao and Reddy. And as discussed last week, that we are going to pick up COP27 this week, will largely be dominated by COP27 and all the agreements done in that meeting. And we'll also try to cover some other news pieces as well. And in the second half, we have other news pieces pertaining to the per capita income of India, how National Food Security Act has impacted that. Then we'll also be covering the release of 6 convicts in the Rajiv Gandhi assassination case, what the Supreme Court has done and what are the powers with it. Then apart from it, we will also be looking into some other important topics with respect to international relations like India, ASEAN and all. So this is going to be the agenda of this week's class, and all the topics in this week were not 100% covered, but yes, majority of them were covered, but yes, the leftover ones we will be covering next week also, don't worry on that. Okay. So without wasting any time, let's start the class. The first concept which we're going to take up is this concept of greenwashing. I don't know how many of you might have heard this term, but yes, UPSC is quite fond of asking questions that recently a term dash was in news. What does it refer to? Ya fir it can ask greenwashing refers to. It can give you 4 options. Okay, and as the name suggests, greenwashing. Green is there, so something related to the environment will definitely be attached. So let's look into it, that what is actually greenwashing and why was it in news. So UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned companies and other non-state entities pursuing net zero goals to not indulge in greenwashing. Not indulge in greenwashing simply implies that greenwashing is something which is not a healthy practice. What is it? Now at times what happens, companies, non-government entities, even the governments, they claim that their actions are I would say eco-friendly in nature. Their actions are saving these much emissions. Their claims are like this, but actually this is not the reality. So in reality it is different. It is not saving the environment, but the claims are being made that the environment is being saved. That this particular concept is called as greenwashing. It actually does not help. It actually harms the environment, because when a company or a government is making claims, then the monitoring authorities or the authorities which are there, they are relaxed. Chalo, things are taking place, emissions are being controlled and all. But in reality, emissions are not being controlled. So that is the issue, and this particular concept in which a false image is being created by the companies, by the government, that environment is being saved, emissions are being reduced, X, Y, Z, whatever claims they are making for conserving the environment, but those claims are false. This concept is called as greenwashing. Okay. An expert group was set up by United Nations to tackle the issue of greenwashing, and it was formed last year, and now it has given recommendations that greenwashing should be strictly prohibited, and some other recommendations. We'll just look into it. What is greenwashing? Just explained what is greenwashing. I'll just repeat it. Range of activities that companies or even countries indulge into present misleading or dubious claims about their climate action. There is a growing tendency among firms and governments, obviously, that to mark all the kind of activity as climate friendly. Like for example, if any country is doing an investment in India and that country says or claims that this investment will reduce emissions or we are doing it in a climate friendly way, but actually it is neither going to reduce emissions nor they are doing it in climate friendly way, that particular act will be called as an act of greenwashing. So these are some of the dubious claims which the governments and all make. Okay. Now there is a growing tendency among them. It helps in boosting the image of that entity or the government, and at times, when a company or an organization keeps on doing activities and claiming that my activities are climate friendly, my activities are climate friendly, there might also be a chance for that particular company to gain some undue advantages, because the image of that company will become such. And undue advantages, like for example, government has rolled out a project, the government will prefer to delegate that project to a private company which is all doing the work efficiently and also saving the environment. But actually it is saving the environment or not, the company only knows. Okay, so this is something which is there. Now some examples of greenwashing in the past. Now in I would say 2015 or 16, I don't remember the year exactly, but this company Volkswagen, which manufactures cars, it is a German company, and it was involved in a scandal. It was called as a scandal of greenwashing. And what it did, it manufactured green diesel vehicles. Green diesel vehicles were simply those kind of vehicles which were diesel vehicles, which were using diesel, but Volkswagen was claiming that these companies or these particular products, the cars, are emitting less pollutants as compared to other diesel vehicles. But reality was something different. It was not. So that was called an act of greenwashing, when the regulator actually judged that or actually audited the emissions and all. The emissions were not as per the standards or as per the claims made by Volkswagen. That was called an act of greenwashing. Then developed countries are all often it is required from the developed countries to invest in developing countries. This investment, this finance is called as climate finance for conserving environment. Now at times the developed countries are investing in developing countries, but these investments may not be actually climate friendly, but the developed countries are claiming those kind of investments to be climate friendly, and that is why it is called an act of greenwashing. And there should be someone as a regulator to monitor such kind of activities, that whether your claims being made that these kind of activities are conserving the environment or not, there a certain kind of regulator should be there to monitor your claims, okay, which is presently absent. Then several other multinational corporations like Shell, BP, Coca-Cola, they have faced accusations of greenwashing. Like Coca-Cola was claiming that it is treating water and then emitting it in the environment, but the quality of water which was being emitted by Coca-Cola was not of that level which was being claimed. So that was also called as an act of greenwashing. So these are the kind of examples at the international level of greenwashing. India can be at the receiving end of greenwashing, where big I would say developed countries, they are doing investments in India, claiming that they are saving the environment, but in actually they are not doing it. So India will be the sufferer, and those developed countries, they will claim that they have done their work, they have done the investment, but in actuality that investment is not saving the environment. In fact, the environment is getting polluted. Reasons for spread of greenwashing, why greenwashing is so widely spread, or it is gaining momentum. There is lack of regulation and standardization. As I told you that there is no such regulator sitting on the top and regulating the activities. Then the processes, methodologies and institutions to measure, report and verify claims, they are also, being set up presently. They are not stabilized yet. Then a large number of organizations have sprung up claiming expertise in these areas and offering their services for a fee. They say that, whatever actions you do, we'll come, we'll give it a climate touch. And climate touch means, your all the actions will be saving the environment, whereas in actuality they are not doing so. Okay. Then many of these organizations lack integrity and robustness, but their services are still availed by corporations because they make them look good. Now, to explain these 2 points, let's suppose I am a big company, like let's suppose I am Coca-Cola, and there's a third party, a small company, which comes to me and says, Coca-Cola, you are emitting water in the environment after treating and all, whatever you are manufacturing, Coke and all. So what we'll do, we'll enrich the quality of that water. That small company tells me that I'm Coca-Cola, and that small company tells me that I'll do this, I'll enhance the quality of the water being released by you in the environment. These are my processes and all, and with this, your I would say image will improve. Okay, as a responsible company, I will say, okay, you come, I'll pay you for this, you do this. They start doing it, but whatever claims they made to me, those are not being fulfilled by them. So this kind of phenomenon happens, but this particular company is making my image improve. They're making claims, and by doing this they are earning money, or they are doing their business by improving my image. Okay, so these kind of companies are not capable enough to do so for in a longer run, and that is why greenwashing keeps on happening. Way forward, what should be the way forward with respect to greenwashing? An expert group in this report recommended that corporations pursuing net zero targets, those corporations who are pursuing net zero targets, means net zero means whatever they are emitting, simultaneously they have made provisions for consuming them. Let's suppose again I am Coca-Cola, I am doing X amount of emissions, I should have done afforestation, I should have planted that much forests which are taking X amount of emissions back, which are sucking in, which are sinking in. So that is net zero. Okay. Must not be allowed to make fresh investment in fossil fuels, because fossil fuels will do emissions. Must be asked to present short-term emission reduction goals on the path to achieve net zero. Every company gives long-term goals because they know that in longer term, things can happen, things can change, and we'll be able to achieve. But short-term goals no one gives. So these should be given. Must bring an end to all activities that lead to deforestation. And it also recommended the creation of regulatory structures, which I'm saying right from the very beginning, that regulatory body is not there, standards are not set, and this should be there in place as soon as possible to control greenwashing. Okay, so this is greenwashing. United Nations set up a committee to look into greenwashing. Who can indulge into greenwashing? The private companies, non-government entities, even the government entities can indulge. What is greenwashing? Greenwashing is the false claims made by the companies with respect to climate conservation or environment conservation. Examples: Volkswagen, Coca-Cola and all. We saw many governments also all around the world. Reasons: the major reason is lack of regulatory mechanism is there. Regulatory mechanism should be set up first. Okay, so this is basically greenwashing. Now, COP 27 of UNFCCC. First of all, UNFCCC, United Nations Framework to Combat Climate Change. Okay. Now, to understand this concept, COP 27 of UNFCCC, we'll have to go back to 1972, I would say. Okay. And we'll begin our story from there. And when we begin our story from there, you'll be able to connect better with it. I'll not be going too deep into the story, but yes, whatever requirements are there, and in our future lecture presently, what all is going to be coming, I'll be discussing here the brief glimpses of it, and then we'll be dealing with it in detail. My request is that take a pen and paper with you and you note it down over there as well. Okay, so we'll discuss UNFCCC, United Nations Framework to Combat Climate Change. Now, what is climate change? First, we'll discuss this in brief. This is the earth, this is the sun. Radiations are coming from the sun, and ideally there should be a situation that whatever amount of radiations the earth is receiving, the same amount of radiations is radiated back by the earth. This is the ideal situation, but actually this does not happen. You might read about heat budget in geography NCERT class 11th or 12th, I think, in class 11th it is. So heat budget of the earth suggests this, that whatever insolation or whatever incoming solar radiation we are receiving, the equivalent amount of radiation should be radiated back. But this does not happen. This does not happen. Why? Because of our atmosphere. Our atmosphere, this is our atmosphere, the outer layer which I have drawn. This is our atmosphere where all the gases are present. Okay. And there are multiple gases present over here in our atmosphere which we breathe. Oxygen, take out carbon dioxide and all. Okay. But over the years what has happened, the composition of these gases has been altered. The composition of these gases has been altered. Why? Because humans' activities basically have emitted a lot of carbon dioxide and other harmful gases. As of now, you have to understand these gases as harmful activities. We've set up a lot of factories. We go by cars. We emit a lot, and emission of these gases has led to a phenomenon, that is that these solar radiations, they come to the earth, but they get trapped in the atmosphere. They are not able to go back. Why they are not able to go back? Because of these gases. These gases have created an effect which is called as greenhouse effect. What is a greenhouse? If you go in a nursery, there are some temporary constructions where the sunlight is allowed to come in, plants and all are kept over there, but the sunlight is not allowed to escape. There is ample amount of heat in that particular greenhouse. That is called as greenhouse effect. Or another example to understand greenhouse effect is your car in the summer months, it is there in the sun, and it is there for an hour or two, and you open that car after 2 hours, let's suppose, you see how hot it is. The heat is allowed to come in, but it is not allowed to escape. This is called as greenhouse effect. This greenhouse effect here has been caused by these gases which has been emitted by the humans and are still being emitted, and these gases are referred to as greenhouse gases, which are leading to trapping of heat energy in our atmosphere. And this trapping of heat energy in our atmosphere is basically causing global warming, or basically it is changing the climate. That is called as climate change or global warming. Okay. Now, can we reduce emissions? Definitely. Can we make emissions zero? We cannot. We have to develop, we have to survive, and for our survival we will have to emit. And you know, there has been considerations made by United Nations and other international organizations which are dealing with climate change. For example, UNFCCC only, they have made this consideration that, you know, we cannot resort to this position where we are emitting zero. We will emit, but what we have to do, emit, and we have to grow some trees or, you know, some entities which will sink in those gases. And, you know, if we are able to, you know, create such a situation, such an equilibrium where we are emitting, and whatever amount we are emitting, we are sinking in that much amount. Just trees and all, they take in carbon dioxide and give oxygen. So plant more and more trees. Okay. So this is, the trees act like carbon sink. If a situation like this comes, then we will become net zero, not zero emitter, but net zero emitter. Okay. So this is the concept of net zero. Greenhouse gases, CO2, methane, CFCs, PF6, then ozone. These are some of the HFCs. These are some of the greenhouse gases. Okay. Now, do you know that a CO2 molecule, CO2 I am talking about only here, CO2 is the most widespread greenhouse gas. It is the most widespread greenhouse gas, means in our atmosphere, the maximum amount of, if any GHG is present, that is CO2. And a molecule of CO2 is potent enough to stay in the atmosphere for 150 to 200 years. That means, you know, if any molecule or any emission which was done by the industrialized nations or the developed nations of today, way back 150 to 200 years ago, it is still there in the atmosphere and, you know, causing global warming. This is the lifespan of CO2. CH4, CFCs, PF6 and all, these are basically short-lived. Okay? Their life is not so long. But the maximum potential to cause global warming is of methane, CH4. It is of methane. The maximum longevity is of CO2. The maximum amount in which any GHG is present in the atmosphere is CO2. Okay. So this is basically the basics of climate change, global warming. Now, we also cannot restrict that whatever emissions we are doing will stay over Delhi or stay over India only. Those emissions can go to China, those emissions can go to Pakistan, Bangladesh, they can go anywhere. And hence, global warming is not a national issue, but it is an international issue. All the nations collectively will have to come for it and find a solution. And this was the thought process, this was the wisdom that the nations got in 1960s. And in 1972, there was this meeting in Stockholm. And in this meeting, this was the first ever meeting in human history for, you know, when countries talked about conserving the environment. First meeting in human history under United Nations, where countries talked about conserving the environment, and here they rolled out or they established a body which was called as United Nations Environment Program. The environment program basically was talking about, you know, how to conserve the environment, how to create cooperation between the countries for doing this. And, you know, efforts did not, you know, turn out the way they were expected to turn out. And, you know, eventually time passed by, and in 1992, There was this Rio summit. It is also called as the Earth Summit. Where, we rolled out 3 frameworks with respect to climate change. First was United Nations Framework to Combat Climate Change, UNFCCC. Second was United Nations Convention on Biodiversity. Third was United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. These were the 3 frameworks, all directly or indirectly related to climate change. United Nations Framework to Combat Climate Change was directly related to climate change, but this was for conservation of biodiversity, that was for combating desertification. Desertification is when the land quality degrades and it starts to turn infertile, and then eventually it converts into a desert. Biodiversity pertains to biological diversity. Biological means living species, the diversity of living beings or living species including flora and fauna. And then climate change. Climate change has an impact on biodiversity, because due to climate change, if global warming is happening, biodiversity can reduce, because there are some species which cannot bear the heat, they will die and eventually they will go extinct. Climate change can lead to desertification, quite commonsensical it is. But anyways, what I want to discuss here is that all these conventions had their respective meetings or their respective conference of parties, and they started their journey. And now the Conference of Parties 27, the 27th meeting after 1992 of UNFCCC is happening in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. Are there earlier meetings which are important for us to know? Yes, definitely there are. I'll tell you about the 3 meetings which are important for us to know. Then UNCBD, it has its own conference of parties, it has its own pace of meeting. UNCCD, again it has its own conference of parties. And very recently, not very recently, but in May 2022, that is this year only, COP15 of UNCCD was held. That was the 15th meeting. But whenever COP comes, COP is basically a generic term. COP stands for Conference of Parties. But this Conference of Parties of what? Of UNCCD, of UNCBD, or of UNFCCC. This has to be noted. Okay. So this is the first of all the basic explanation of this. But yes, if I talk about one of the first important meetings under UNFCCC, that was Kyoto Protocol. It was held in 1997 in the city of Japan, Kyoto. Now in this Kyoto Protocol, basically it was decided that all the countries in the world will be divided into 2. Annexure 1 countries, Annexure 2 countries, or Annexure A, Annexure B. What I mean to say is developed and developing or underdeveloped. Now it was said to the developed countries of the world that you are developed today at the expense of developing countries. Whatever money you possess is because you exploited the developing countries and did not let them develop. How? The European countries in the 19th century, in the early 20th century also, they had colonies all over the world. India was one such colony of the Europeans, like Britishers. They looted us. Likewise, they looted all their colonies, accumulated the wealth, got developed at the expense of that wealth, and we were left underdeveloped or are still developing. So it was clearly highlighted in the Kyoto Protocol that the developed countries have developed at the expense of developing countries, and hence it is the responsibility of developed countries to help the developing countries develop. Chalo, nothing about climate change till now, but now about climate change. The developed countries, under Kyoto Protocol it is, you have this restriction on emissions. You cannot restrict more than this amount. Whereas the developing countries, you do not have any restrictions on emissions. You can emit whatever amount you want. So this was one such thing. The developed countries, if you emit more than this much amount, the restriction amount or the threshold amount, you will have to invest an amount equivalent to that extra emissions in developing countries on green projects. Green projects means those projects which are for climate change, for tackling for climate change. So this was there in Kyoto Protocol. Obviously this was not liked by many developed countries. Kyoto Protocol came into existence in 2005, signed in 1997, but it came into, I would say, force in 2005, stayed there in force till 2005 and stayed there in force till 2015, 10 years. And in 2015 we had COP21, Paris Pact we call it. Now in the Paris Pact, what happened, why we picked up Paris Pact and all, just a build up to Paris Pact. Many developed countries who did not like the provisions of COP or did not like the provisions of Kyoto Protocol, they simply, were criticizing Kyoto Protocol, and the country where Kyoto Protocol was signed, that is Japan, it backed out from the Kyoto Protocol in 2011. And there were such other countries like USA and all which also backed out. Their main logic was that why restriction emissions on us? Why not on developing countries? And now the developing countries like China and India, China the world's largest emitter, India the third largest emitter, no restrictions on them, restrictions on us. This is not fair and we are not going to be part of this. They backed out of this Kyoto Protocol. But climate change was still happening, global warming was still happening, so we had to do something. The United Nations came out with one more COP, that is COP21, the Paris Pact. It happened in 2015. India participated, many other countries participated. And in this Paris Pact COP21, this bifurcation developed, developing was done away with, restrictions done away with, a new concept came, and this new concept was called as INDCs. INDCs basically stand for Intended Nationally Determined Contributions. Now, the countries all over the world, whether developing, underdeveloped or developed, they have to determine by themselves that what will be their contribution in conserving the environment. And after determining, you go for it, have to fulfill the targets. The developed countries will be financing you, will be giving you funds, because the developed countries, since 2009, there was this meeting in 2009, also one COP was there in I think a European country only. There the developed countries pledged that we will invest $100 billion in a year in developing countries for mitigating climate impact, or for, I would say, tackling climate change. So the developing countries will get the finance from developed countries, but you roll out your own INDCs, and in INDCs basically you determine by yourself that what would be your contribution in conserving the environment. Chalo, all the countries gave, And United Nations also said that in 5 years time, it is required that you upgrade your in INDCs. Okay. Chalo, India gave 3 INDCs. What were the 3 INDCs? We'll see. The first INDC was, to reduce emission intensity by 33 to 35% of the 2005 levels. What is emission intensity? Emission intensity, as I told you, that to develop you will need to emit. So what amount of emissions you are doing to generate 1 unit of GDP? That is emission intensity. Repeating it, what amount of emissions you are doing to generate 1 unit of GDP? Okay. Emission intensity we have to reduce by 33 to 35% of the 2005 levels, means whatever our emission intensity was there in 2005, from that level we have to reduce it to 33 to 35%. The second was 40% of our electricity should be generated from non-fossil based fuels. NFBFs, non-fossil based fuels. Fossil fuels are coal, petroleum and all. Non-fossil based fuels are basically nuclear power, hydropower, solar power, wind power, tidal power. Not necessarily all are renewable energy, but yes, those are not based on fossils. The emissions will not be as such as there are in fossil fuels. Then the third was to create an additional 2.5 to 3 gigatons of carbon dioxide's carbon sink. Carbon sink we know. So create additional carbon sink that can sink in 2.5 to 3 gigatons of CO2. These were the 3 INDCs which were pledged by India in Paris. And countries all over the world were saying that these INDCs are too ambitious for India. India, being a developing country, cannot meet them. And people in India were also claiming this to be. But as I said that in 2015 INDC or this COP21 Paris Pact, it was agreed or it was envisaged that after 5 years they have to be revised. So in the next COP or after, not in the next but in 2021 COP26 was there in Glasgow, UK. We revised our INDCs. Earlier we had 3, now we had 5. What are these 5? We'll see abhi. Okay. But this year we had COP27 in Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. We'll be discussing COP27, and in the line or in the process we'll also be taking up glimpses of COP26, that is Glasgow, and there we will be discussing India's revised INDCs. Okay. I hope you might have understood the story, and whenever need be I'll come back to this board wherever necessary. Now, United Nations Framework for Combating Climate Change Conference 2022 COP27, Sharm el Sheikh, Egypt. It is basically a resort town, or I would say coastal town. It builds on the outcomes of COP26 that happened in Glasgow, where India revised its INDCs. Agenda: COP27 seeks renewed solidarity between countries. Renewed solidarity between countries. Why? Because the developed countries have to invest in developing countries, and despite of these investments coming in, how solidarity can be remained. Okay. Paris Agreement adopted in 2015 for people and the planet was there. Now, one of the most pressing agendas is loss and damage in COP27, which was discussed. Loss and damage. What is loss and damage? We should understand this term as well. It refers to the costs the rich and developed countries who are majorly responsible for industrial emissions should pay to poorer nations that have made negligible contributions to climate change but are suffering from it. The developed nations, they have contributed, or they have, I would say, emitted a lot in the past. Industrial revolution happened there in Europe. All the emissions were done at that time, and we all know that carbon dioxide stays in the atmosphere for 150 to 200 years. Now, the smaller nations who did not emit at that time, who did not develop at that time, but today are facing the brunt of climate change or the negative impacts of climate change. These small nations should be compensated by the developed nations, because there is loss happening in these small nations and damage is being done, and that loss and damage should be compensated by the developed nations. And we discussed a topic way back when the floods came in Pakistan. Pakistan was demanding the developed nations that you need to give us money so that we can make up for our loss and damage. Why it was asking the developed nations? Because they believed that the floods have come in Pakistan due to climate change, and climate change is not caused by Pakistan, it is caused by the developed countries. Climate reparation was the topic, and this has been discussed at length in COP27 with respect to loss and damage. It has been discussed. Developing countries including India will push the rich countries to agree to a new global climate finance target. We will push. Nothing has been concrete, nothing has been come out, nothing has been finalized. It is also known as the new collective quantified goal on climate finance, NCQG, to bear the cost of addressing adaptability to climate change. So, loss and damage is this loss and damage which is happening in the small nations due to climate change, to which these small nations have not contributed. Okay. Then, status of emissions and global warming today, nowadays, has made it clear that the climate catastrophe is unfolding. Global warming has already touched 1.1 degrees Celsius, and extreme weather events are becoming more frequent and severe. Now, what is this 1.1 degrees Celsius? We will go back to the board. Now, in this 2015 COP21 which happened in Paris, we decided that by the end of this century, that is this year, 2100, okay, the temperature should increase only by 1.5 degrees Celsius. Only by 1.5 degrees Celsius from the pre-industrial levels. Pre-industrial levels is 1850 to 1900. These 50 years average temperature, let's suppose it is 24 degrees, and by 2100 it should be 25.5 degrees Celsius. The 1.5 degrees Celsius target we kept for us in the Paris Pact. But what we are witnessing, that 1.1 to abhi ho gaya, 1.1 is now only. Okay. So, this is a challenge for us. Limited outcomes of the support. The current commitments and policies of different nations means INDCs of different nations which are currently there in place. If they will be there, then 2.8 degrees temperature will rise by 2100. Target is 1.5. But with the current situation, the current INDCs, if we consider, 2.8 degrees Celsius will increase. And we studied about the emission gap report just 2 weeks ago, I think, and in that emission gap report also it was mentioned that with the current INDCs in place, 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius will increase. So UNFCCC is saying 2.8. Anyways, okay. Now gripping worry. Now there is a lot of crisis in Europe with respect to energy imports. Europe dependent upon Russia for its energy imports, and due to the war going on, the imports or the situation has been challenging. And this situation has been challenging for Europe with respect to energy imports. Now, this situation highlights towards the fact that more and more transition should be made towards this renewable energy or non-fossil based energy. Natural gas is a fossil based energy, and if we move towards renewable energy more and more, these kind of crises can be averted in the future. The political crisis also will be averted. Our dependencies will reduce. Okay. Major emitters making decisive difference. Who are the major emitters? Obviously, the most developed are still the major emitters. The G20 countries account for over 70% of global carbon emissions. Okay. G20 we will be covering next week because India has assumed the presidency of that. Actions of these nations would determine the fate of humankind and all. Okay. So, it is the developed countries or the major economies of the world which are making a major difference. Now, prime emitters. Now, to understand this point, prime emitters, we have to understand two things. First is that total emissions being made, and second is the emission per capita which is being made. Okay. Per capita means per head how much emissions are being made. Now the per capita emissions is highest for USA. The population is less, emissions are more. Okay. But absolute terms, if I talk about absolute terms, the emissions are highest by China, and China has occupied the #1 position since last 15 years now. The second in that category is USA, and the third is India. But when I talk about per capita, USA is the highest. Okay. Then Europe and all is there. India is at the 6th rank. Okay. China is there on the 2nd place, that is 8.4 tons per capita. Okay. Europe is at 6.8 tons per capita, and India is 6th. India's per capita emission is somewhere around I think 3 to 4. Okay. You just check on Google, but yes, India is on the 6th position in this particular category per capita. But when it comes to absolute emissions, China is the world's biggest emitter for over 15 years. Okay. But when I talk about emissions since 1850, only 11% of emissions in the atmosphere are by China. Yeah. Like when we go back to the board again. Now these emissions which are there in the atmosphere, these emissions have been there from very long, and all the countries in the world have contributed. So out of these emissions, only 11% are emitted by China, and China is the world's largest emitter from the last 15 years. This points out towards the fact that other countries have emitted more, and the emissions have stayed there for longer period. Then Russia, Canada, Japan and Australia, their combined greenhouse contribution is 65%. India is currently at the 3rd position in this. It is the 3rd largest emitter, and it accounts for only 3% of historical emissions. Means only 3% of emissions which are there in the atmosphere presently are by India. Then limited promises. In 2009, as I told you, the developed countries agreed to provide $100 billion every year from 2020 to developing nations, but this has not been materialized. Okay. Things are picking up, but $100 billion mark is not yet reached. Okay. The Warsaw International Mechanism for Loss and Damage was also signed in 2013, which is first international framework for this climate finance. It is not under United Nations, but yes, it was a separate meeting by it is not under UNFCCC, but it is a separate meeting, the Warsaw International Mechanism. Then global climate finance is the next topic. Global climate finance. Climate finance basically deals with financing those projects which are there for climate conservation and all. The ongoing COP27, India basically has stressed that there should be more finance coming in from developed to the developing countries. And there should be clear-cut target, there should be a roadmap, there should be predictability. The developing and underdeveloped countries should know that what amount of finance is coming, from where it is coming, when it is coming. Everything should be clear. It should not be on the whims and fancies of the developed countries. So India picked this up in COP27. Basically in 2009, in COP15, it was held in Copenhagen in Denmark. There it was agreed that the developed countries will invest $100 billion per year by 2020 to help developing countries tackle the effect of climate change. Rich countries, however, have reportedly failed in delivering in this front. And there is an estimate that trillions of dollars are required for this to mitigate or to reach that 1.5 degree Celsius target. According to data from OECD, OECD is basically an organization of developed countries. Developed countries mobilized $52.5 billion in 2013. It dropped to $44.6 billion in 2015, and after that finance flow has steadily increased. In 2020, the developed countries raised $83.3 billion, a jump from $80.4 billion in 2019. $83.3 billion is still less than $100 billion, but yes, it is increasing year by year. That is the good point. Okay. But what India is saying, ek to $100 billion meet karo. Second, there should be more predictability, more clarity in climate finance for the developing countries by the developed West. Now, how much is actually required? Is $100 billion sufficient? Now, OECD has the answer to this question, and it estimated, it is just an estimate, that resources in the range of $6 trillion to $11 trillion are required till 2030 to meet the targets set by the developing countries for meeting their INDCs. Now, this much amount is required to be given to the developing countries by the developed countries, so that these developing countries can meet their INDCs. Meeting their INDCs will not restrict or not let us achieve that target of 1.5 degrees Celsius. When in the last piece of news we saw that if the countries with the present set of INDCs which the countries have, if they are going, still 2.6 or 2.8 degrees Celsius will be reached by 2100. So, what does it mean? The INDCs need to be upped. Apart from it, the financing needs to be upped also. It is not just ki INDCs need to be upped, the financing also needs to be upped. This financing is not sufficient, the INDCs are not sufficient, that is why presently. This year's COP being held in Egypt, the developed countries are expected to push developing nations to further intensify their climate plans. The developed countries are going to push the developing countries ki bhai intensify your climate plans. But no one is going to push India because India has already done it. in COP26, that happened in Glasgow. Okay. On the other hand, the developing countries would seek commitment to finance. The developing countries will say that give us money, then only we will intensify. We do not have money to intensify. Why we do not have? We are developing, we are underdeveloped. Why so? Because we are underdeveloping, or we are developing or underdeveloped because of you, the developed ones. So give us finance. This is going to be, this is basically the equation, or this is going to be, or this is basically the, I would say, discussion going on between the developed and the developing. Presently, no restrictions on anyone. INDCs are there. A mechanism of climate finance is definitely there, where the developed has to develop, help the developing. So this, I would say, discussions are going on, and COP27's agenda, one of the major agenda is to develop solidarity between the developed and the developing. Then we have Sharm el Sheikh adaptation agenda. Adaptation basically is what? We need to understand this term. Now, what has happened? What happens is, like, I stay in a place, just imagine I stay in a place where earthquakes are frequent. Okay. And they come frequently. So, and I cannot move out of that place. I have all my businesses and all set up over there. So what I do is basically I adapt myself to live over there. I adapt myself. How do I adapt myself? I basically, say that, I'll construct a house which will be earthquake proof. I will practice certain drills, that when an earthquake comes, what we have to do. These kind of activities, or these kind of, I would say, things are called as adaptations. Okay. When you adapt to live with a certain situation, like COVID came, so we adapted, like the mask, sanitizing and all, those were adaptation, I would say, strategies or adaptation activities. You can do whatever you want, but with a mask on. You have to wash your hands regularly. So, certain kind of adaptation has to be done by the countries with respect to climate disasters. What are climate disasters? The disasters which are happening, and the disasters which are happening due to climate change. Climate change is increasing the temperature, the global average temperature, and with increased temperature, more number of cyclones can come. More number of, I would say, more amount of rainfall also can happen, because more amount of evaporation will happen. So these kind of disasters are called as climate induced disasters. Heat waves can come, droughts can come. So this COP27 basically discussed this adaptation agenda. Adaptation to climate induced disasters. Okay. In order to mitigate the disastrous effect of climate change, mitigate means to reduce. COP27 presidency recently launched the Sharm el Sheikh adaptation agenda. The agenda outlines 30 goals to improve resilience for 4 billion people. Improve resilience means improve their strength to fight such kind of disasters, or to face such kind of disasters. Living in the most climate vulnerable communities by 2030. According to IPCC analysis, nearly half of the world's population will be at risk of severe climate change impacts by 2030. Nearly half of the world's population, and world's population is now 8 billion. This week only we went to 8 billion. and nearly half of the world's population by 2030 will be more than 8 billion by 2030 will be facing the risks of climate disasters. And you know what? We will be facing it even if we are living in a 1.5 degree Celsius world. 1.5 degree Celsius world means, if we are on track to achieve that target of 1.5 degree Celsius rise by 2100, then also, half of the population will be at risk. Also during COP27 summit, Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure (CDRI), we discussed in the last class, announced setting up of Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator Fund. We will discuss this abhi, the next to next topic it is. Okay. But since this much amount of population will be at the risk of climate disasters, what best we can do? We can help them adapt to such kind of situations. Simultaneously, we will also be working to reduce emissions and all. I'm not saying that only adaptation we are talking about, but yes, in this adaptation agenda, we are talking about adaptation. In other aspects, we are talking about how to mitigate emissions and all, or how to reduce emissions and all. Now about the agenda, outlines 30 goals for 4 billion people living in the most climate vulnerable communities. Each outcome presents global solutions that can be adopted at a local level to respond to local climate contexts. To respond to hazards like extreme heat, drought, flooding, etc. Collectively, these outcomes represent the first comprehensive global plan to rally both state and non-state actors. State and non-state actors both will be there, means NGOs and all will be also there. These actions are required by the end of this decade across 5 impact systems. These 5 impact systems: food and agriculture, water and nature, coastal and oceans, human settlement and infrastructure, and including enabling solutions for planning and finance. Means when such kind of climate disaster comes, the food and food security should not be compromised. It should be there. People who have been impacted, they should have ample food to eat. Their livelihood, if it is dependent upon agriculture, it should be restored as soon as possible. Water and nature, the impact of, let's suppose, cyclones and all if are there, so effective management of those impacts should be there. Then coastal and oceans, again with respect to the cyclone they are talking about, like there are forests like mangrove forests which are grown in the swamps. Swamps are basically the transition zone between fresh water and salty water. If we increase the mangrove forest, then those mangrove forests actually act as buffer zones or actually act as sinks to the cyclones. The cyclones will fall over there, and the mangroves will take all the, I would say, downfall of cyclones, and it will have less impacts on the humans. Human settlements and infrastructure, they should be made more resilient. They should be made disaster proof, I would say, including enabling solutions for planning and finance. Obviously, the developed to the developing with respect to this. And these are the some targets. Okay. Protecting and restoring 400 million hectares in critical areas which is under agriculture. Use of nature-based solutions to improve water security and livelihoods. Tap into nature-based solutions, investment opportunities of $354 billion. Transform 2 billion hectares of land into sustainable management, like it can be converted into mangroves and all. Protecting 3 billion people by installing smart and early warning systems. Early warning systems, here CDRI is instrument, Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure. India is patronizing it. It is headquartered in New Delhi. Last week we studied. Expanding access to clean cooking for 2.4 billion people. Cooking should be clean, emissions should be less from there. Provide evidence-based actionable adaptation plans for 10,000 cities. increase global consumption of fruits, vegetables, seeds, nuts and legumes by 1.5 times. Now how this will have an impact? First of all, afforestation will happen for these kind of products. Many agricultural activities are also responsible for emitting greenhouse gases like methane. So that will not happen. Apart from it, people will get alternative nutrients to eat. Then promote healthy alternative proteins, which are capturing 15% of the global meat and seafood market. This meat market also, it is basically said to, it is believed that it emits a lot of pollutants or a lot of greenhouse gases. So, we are finding alternatives to that. Okay. So that should be done. Significance: the agenda emphasizes mobilizing 140 to 300 billion dollars from public and private sources for adaptation and resilience. Encourage 2000 of the world's greatest corporations for investing in climate plans and all, for I would say adaptation activities and all, means private corporations we're talking about. The need for all actors to count on evidence based practical adaptation plans. Greenwashing should not happen. It should be evidence based ki bhai, if you have done an action, actually it is saving the environment or not. Okay. Then how it will impact India? India has this Sundarban region, okay, which is basically spans between India and Bangladesh and is home to 7.2 million of the world's most vulnerable people and impacted by disasters like cyclones and all, floods and all. This would benefit from, these people would benefit from adaptation efforts. Mangrove forests can absorb 5 times more carbon emissions than tropical forests and all, 4 to 5 times more. This is there. The mangrove forest can absorb more, 4 to 5 times more, I would say, carbon from the atmosphere. In that aspect, it is good. It also acts as shocks to the cyclones coming in. The cyclone has these mangroves have the capability to absorb the shocks of cyclone. Then also it is good. Okay. So in this way or here, this adaptation can help India. Then next piece of news is with respect to Global Offshore Wind Alliance. Okay. Goa it is called as, and this basically has been joined by Britain, Germany, USA and Japan. Totally there are 9 members, okay, and the 9 members are Belgium, Colombia, Ireland, Japan, Netherlands, Norway, Britain, USA and Japan. And this, out of these 9 members, Britain, Germany, USA and Japan, they have joined Goa in UNCOP 27. There. And why? What is it? Global Offshore Wind Alliance. It is by the name it suggests that it is dealing with wind energy. Okay. And the alliance is supported by a number of organizations which are actively promoting the offshore wind industry in their different regions. Offshore winds are basically winds which are blowing from the land to the oceans, and that generates, that helps in rotating the turbines or generating electricity, renewable form of electricity. Okay. It was set up, this Goa was set up by International Renewable Energy Agency, IRENA. It is based in Denmark, and the Global Wind Energy Council. These two bodies established Goa. Presently 9 members in COP 27. This time these 4 countries joined Goa. About Goa, if I talk about, the Global Offshore Wind Alliance established remove barriers to the energy. Remove barriers to the energy means, there are some barriers for wind energy, like for example, investments can act as barriers. One country is not allowing the other country to invest in the wind energy programs over there. So remove those barriers, allow us to invest, and that is how the investment will flow, or the climate finance will flow. It aims to provide a growing offshore wind industry with a one-stop shop overview of the offshore wind industry events around the world. Means all the offshore wind industry best practices will be here, and people can refer to it and take clue from it. Both IRENA and IEA expect that offshore wind capacity will need to exceed 2000 gigawatts in 2050 from just over 60 gigawatts today. In present time, only 60 gigawatts of electricity is being generated from wind energy, but it is expected that 2000 gigawatts by 2050 should be generated from wind energy, and if it happens, then this 1.5 degrees Celsius target will be a reality, or can be a reality. To reach this target, Goa will aim to contribute in accelerating growth to reach a total of at least 380 gigawatts installed capacity by the end of 2030. Means from 60 to 380 they have to reach all over the world. As I told you, the next topic, infrastructure resilience accelerator fund. The CDRI, Coalition for Disaster Resilience Infrastructure, it announced setting up of IRAF with allocation of $50 million. Okay. Chalo, just to revise a bit, although for those people who were not there in the last class, CDRI basically is a multilateral organization which has been patronized by India. Okay. Basically, Narendra Modi in 2019 as a partnership of national governments. The national governments should be partnering here in CDRI. For what purpose? It aims to promote resilience of new and existing infrastructure systems. New infrastructure system which is getting built, or existing infrastructure which is already there, they should be more resilient. They should be more shock proof to the disasters happening. Disasters, climatic disasters or non-climatic disasters. What any kind of disasters, the infrastructure which is being constructed or which is being built should be resilient, or should be resilient, and there should be an early warning system established for disasters. Early warning systems are basically those systems which give you early warnings with respect to any disaster happening. The government should invest in such kind of systems. It was believed that investing around 60 to 80 million dollars in such kind of a system, that was an early warning system, saved around $4 billion. So it is very efficient. So the early warning systems should be established. Climate or disaster resilient infrastructure systems should be there. Okay. And sustainable development should happen. Besides India, presently it has 28 other members. Now the CDRI has said that this fund should be there, Infrastructure Resilience Accelerator Fund, and allocation $50 million. Okay. It has to increase further. About IRAF, this fund will support global action to build robust infrastructure, especially in developing countries and small island developing nations that can withstand the impacts of climate change. IRAF will be a multi-donor trust fund, people can donate in that, and managed by UN Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, New York. It is supported by India, UK, Australia, European Union, and it will offer customized technical assistance, capacity building, research, knowledge management and advocacy across the infrastructure life cycle of countries at all ages of development. Per se, it is not going to invest in infrastructure projects, but the technical know-how, the knowledge, or I would say the best practices of any infrastructure being constructed, IRAF can be consulted, because IRAF is investing in research and development, adopting best practices and all everywhere. That depository of information is there with IRAF. So any infrastructure project being built, let's suppose in Maldives, so Maldives can take help of IRAF that I am constructing this particular project, please help me that how this project will be climate resistant or disaster resilient. So IRAF will say that adopt this, do this, that, this kind of inputs will be given by them, and the inputs will be implemented by whatever the implementing agency of that infrastructure is. But IRAF is basically a, I would say, kind of library or kind of depository of information, knowledge, or I would say best practices, where countries can ask that how things can be disaster resilient. The next piece of news is Mangrove Alliance for Climate, MAC it is called as. Now I have told you earlier that how mangroves can be beneficial for conserving the environment, or for conserving, I would say, or making us disaster resilient, for absorbing the shocks of a cyclone particularly. For climate change, it has more capability to absorb carbon. Okay. But when we cut mangroves, the stored carbon in the mangroves gets released. So we should not opt for cutting mangroves at all. Okay. So we'll see that what is this Mangrove Alliance for Climate. It is basically spearheaded by UAE in partnership with Indonesia. It was launched at COP27 summit to scale up and accelerate the conservation and restoration of mangrove forests. Mangrove forests should be, restored, and it should proliferate more and more. What are mangroves? It is a shrub or a small tree that grows along the coastlines and has roots in salty sediments, often underwater. They also grow in swamps. Some of the mangroves, they have their roots in the air also, like from the soil it is coming back in the air. Okay. But majorly the roots are in water, salty water. Mangrove forests can survive extreme weather conditions and require low oxygen levels to survive. However, mangroves cannot survive freezing temperatures, and hence they are found mainly in the tropics. They are not found here in the extratropics. UNESCO celebrates July 26 as International Day for Conservation of the Mangroves, to raise awareness about mangrove ecosystem and all, how important mangroves are now. About MAC, the alliance basically, which is spearheaded by UAE, is basically, it will raise the awareness about role of mangroves as nature-based solutions to climate change. These are some nature-based solutions for climate change because it has the capacity to absorb more carbon. The MAC seeks to scale up, accelerate conservation, restoration and growing plantation efforts of mangrove system. According to MAC, mangrove forest can store 10 times more carbon per hectare than terrestrial forests. Also, they can store carbon up to 400% faster, means it can store more and it can store faster. According to Global Mangrove Alliance, when the mangroves are cut, the carbon stored in these plants get released in the air, as I told you. So, preserving them to keep carbon emissions level low is necessary. Then there is a technical term which is coming up, it is called as blue carbon. Once the plants die, these mangroves die, they take the stored carbon in the soil. The carbon, if you cut the mangroves, the carbon in them will get emitted. But if you don't cut them, they die. The stored carbon will be contributing to the carbon in the soil, okay, where they are dying. So that carbon which has been contributed by the death of mangroves is called as blue carbon. Okay. And mangrove forests act as natural barriers against rising tides and storms and cyclones. Each year they prevent property damages of over $65 billion. That is why they are very, very important. But the challenge is that they can only be grown in coastal areas. Now, mangroves in India, if I talk about, India contributes nearly half of the mangroves cover in South Asia. Means the total mangroves found in South Asia, half of them are in India. According to the Forest Survey Report 2021, mangroves in the country cover 4992 square kilometers, this much area, which is 0.15% of the country's total geographical area. And since 2019, the cover has risen, but only by a very less quantity. When I talk about the state which has the highest number of mangroves, it is West Bengal, followed by Gujarat. And here is the list, you can go through it. Third number is Andaman Nicobar Island, then Andhra Pradesh, Odisha, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, Goa, Karnataka, Kerala. Okay. Almost all the coastal states, they have mangroves. Okay. So, this is about mangroves in India. Now, next piece of news is sovereign green bonds. Sovereign green bonds, basically, to understand sovereign green bonds, you have to understand that what are green bonds. Okay. Green bonds are basically issued by, first of all, understand what a bond is. Okay. Bond is basically an investment instrument. Let's suppose I am a company and I want to invest in a particular project of my company, but I don't have the funds. So, what I will do? I will issue bonds, I will take money from the people and people will invest, and in those bond papers it is written that after this much time I am going to return you this much. I will invest that money in the projects and do that. Similarly, green bonds are those bonds which are issued by organizations, private organizations or the governments, if the government wants or that organization wants to invest in some climate related project. Investing in climate related project is compulsory, then only that particular bond will be called as a green bond. Okay. Now, the topic is sovereign green bonds. Sovereign is that these green bonds, these bonds which are green, are issued by countries, are issued by the government of India. Okay. The central government has released the sovereign green bond framework and it will be deployed in public sector projects. Means the government will be raising funds by issuing sovereign green bonds, and those funds will be implemented in public sector projects only. Those public sector projects will be aimed at conserving the environment. Definitely, that is why green bonds they are called as. Okay. Background: in Union Budget 2022-23, Finance Minister announced that green projects will be implemented, and for green projects green bonds will be issued. Prime Minister Narendra Modi at COP26 in November 2021 said that Panchamrit means the 5 new INDCs which India has pledged, we will be following that, and for meeting those Panchamrit, green bonds are necessary because investment is necessary, not only from the developed, from our people also it is necessary. Okay. So, this is there. Then Panchamrit, what are these 5 new INDCs of India which India has pledged? To raise the non-fossil fuel based energy capacity of the country to 500 gigawatts by 2030. Presently, it is somewhere around 170 gigawatts. 167 के आसपास है, but we have to take it to 500 gigawatts. By 2030, 50% of the country's energy requirements should be met by renewable energy sources. In the earlier INDCs, it was 40%. The country will reduce the total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons between now and the year 2030. The carbon intensity or the emission intensity of the economy would be reduced to, or it will be reduced by 45%. The earlier it was 33 to 35%. And India would become a carbon neutral and achieve net zero emissions by the year 2070. Net zero, we know the concept of net zero. These are the Panchamrits, and to achieve this Panchamrits we need funding. Funding we will definitely get by issuing green bonds. Now, the sovereign green bond framework of India, to mobilize 16,000 crore through issuance of green bonds in current fiscal ending March 2023. The Finance Ministry every year will inform the RBI about the spending on green projects. Now, projects which are included, first of all, which are not included, there is some, I would say, mismatch here, but which are included, all eligible green expenditure will be basically done in the government sector only, in the form of investments, subsidies, grants and aids or tax foregons. R&D also, if someone wants to do, they can use the green funds, the government bodies only. Which are not included, nuclear power generation, landfill projects, alcohol, weapons, tobacco, gaming, palm oil industries, hydropower plants larger than 25 megawatts. These are not included in green bonds project, or means these projects will not invite expenditure by issuing of green bonds, and the expenditure should be made within 1 year from the issuance of green bonds. That is a, I would say, compulsion. Implementing agency, the Green Finance Working Committee, in basically this is the implementing agency which includes members from relevant line ministries chaired by the Chief Economic Advisor of India. And the funds which will be received by issuing those green bonds will be deposited in the Consolidated Fund of India, and from there the funds will be disbursed. The GFWC will meet at least twice a year to support Ministry of Finance with selection and evaluation of projects, and the allocation of proceeds will be reviewed in a time bound manner by GFWC to ensure that the allocation of proceeds is completed within 24 months from the date of issuance. So, this is about the green bond framework of India. We will take a break, and with respect to COP27, we have completed all the topics. The first half, as I told you, will dominate with it. We will take a break and we will meet within 15 minutes.